You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
And welcome, Hoosier fans, to this week's edition of Assembly Call Radio, where each week we discuss the most important topics in the world of Indiana basketball. This is our 335th edition of Assembly Call Radio, and it is our 1036th episode overall of the Assembly Call, recorded on the evening of May 30th, 2024. I am your host, the coach, Brian Tonsoni. And let's begin this edition of the Assembly Call, how we begin every edition of the Assembly Call, and that is with our Hoosier Proud banner moment.
And Indiana is the national champion.
When it comes down, Indiana will be champion.
Smart takes the shot.
The Hoosiers have won the national championship.
This week's banner moment occurred with the announcement of a home contest versus an SEC school, South Carolina, coming to Assembly Hall. Adding a power conference home game is always good for all parties involved. It gives Indiana the opportunity to play a solid opponent in the non-conference, and it gives fans an opportunity to see a quality opponent in Assembly Hall. This continues a small trend the last 2 years as Indiana played Kansas at home last year. It's also important in scheduling appropriately to win in the non-conference and win games, not just the bye games, but against quality opponents, as Indiana has struggled recently against some of the bigger names that they've played when we've gone to Vegas and Atlanta and so forth. Bringing South Carolina in is good for the resume. Not only does Indiana need to beat those quality opponents, but then those bye games, they need to be ready with the new roster as early as possible to win appropriately to build up their rankings, their KenPom, their net rankings for Selection Sunday. With the constant and quick-changing landscape of college athletics, scheduling will take on an even greater importance as these squads get put together each and every year. South Carolina on a Saturday is a good addition. And also, we have the battle for Atlantis in November with 3 games with 3 quality opponents. So scheduling and playing well against that schedule is vital for Indiana's chances to have a successful season, and add in teams like South Carolina. And we will keep track of the additions as the schedule games get confirmed. But scheduling well and then getting ready to play well right from the jump is something that Indiana has not done recently that they do need. I like this South Carolina edition. Okay, now let me introduce my co-host for the week. The regular crew is all away, but we just have what the doctor needed, or actually the doctor himself. So, ladies and gentlemen, he is the head of the sports media department at Indiana University, the author of Social Media and Sports, and one of the true OGs of not just IU sports podcasting, but all sports podcasting, as a host of the long-running Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio, welcome to the show. What's on your mind this week with Indiana athletics?
Oh, first of all, Coach, good to see you, and good to see all you folks joining. I think the biggest thing on my mind right now is the vibe coming out of Huber's from last night, largely from Kurt Signetti, who just continues to rattle off one-liners and bring attention to this program. I'm really thrilled. That event last night, Zach Osterman wrote a really nice piece about it. A really important thing for IU athletics in terms of raising money for NIL. And obviously we're going to talk a lot about the business of college sports a little bit later in the show, but I think people don't realize how much infrastructure IU has built already behind the scenes to put themselves in the best position with name, image, and likeness and the money that's going to be flying around college sports. You've seen the evidence. You've seen it not just in football. You've also seen it, obviously, with this basketball transfer portal class. There's a lot of exciting things going on right now, and that was awesome to see last night. I wish I was able to go. I actually was supposed to be at the event, had to call off at the last minute, go down to Atlanta because we were nominated for an award with the sports media program, but was happy to see so many other people there, and looking forward to the next event.
Well, congratulations on being nominated for the award. That's always good. You guys do just excellent work there at the IU school, media school. Just, I wish that was around, or I had participated back in the old days. Knowing some of your students and getting to work with some of your students that you do, it's just remarkable.
I mean, I wish it had been
well-deserving
around.
kudos.
I appreciate that. I wish it had been around when I was a student. It was not, so it's been a labor of love, but happy to have such a great setup. We have so many talented kids now in the program that it's always great to work with them. So yeah, great to see some accolades finally.
So coming up on the show today, we got a few Hoosier headlines. We've mentioned a few of them, Hubers, the scheduling, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then in segment 2, we're going to talk about what's going on in college sports. A few lawsuits have been tried to be settled or on the path to being settled, which will change business as it is right now, which is already the wild, wild west, which we are benefiting from already because of the forethought of our administration and the people involved with the collectives. We'll answer some questions. We'll probably move some questions up to segment 2. You did a really good job of getting questions to this. All of that is coming up this week on Assembly Call Radio. But now let's talk about our presenting sponsor. This edition of Assembly Call Radio, just like all shows on the Back Home Network, is presented by our friends at Home Field Apparel, where they have the largest collection of vintage IU apparel that you'll find anywhere. And it's not just IU. Home Field has unique, interesting designs printed on the softest, most comfortable fabrics for over 150 colleges and universities, plus plenty of other brands like Little 5, IndyCar, and on and on and on. There's always some expanding going on, trying something new, including the new Sweet Summer 7 subscription box, which features 7 new schools, 7 quirky mascots, and 7 incredible shirts. So if you're interested in that, go subscribe. Like always, subscribe to them via text, email, social media, so you always find out what their new stuff's going on. Galen, what's caught your eye from Home Field here recently?
Well, I'm really excited about this upcoming release that they're doing. We got UC Santa Cruz. We've got Pepperdine. We've got North Florida. Just some great new quirky mascots. As you can see, I had to wear the UC Irvine baseball tee tonight, just kind of in celebration of the fact that is going to drop. But I'm still caught up on that Indy 500 collection. That Indy 500 hat that I've got, the Snake Pit T-shirt. I mean, just a ton of great stuff. The designers have been working overtime, and it's a great time to know that Home Field Apparel exists and know that you can get 15% off with the code.
Absolutely. Pepperdine Wave, I'm going to be all over that stuff as soon as possible. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use our promo code HOME23, get that 15% off. Again, that's HOME23 for 15% off, and the website is homefieldapparel.com, wear one for the team. So segment 1, Hoosier headlines. We talked about the scheduling note, South Carolina, November 16th. It's a Saturday. Time will be announced. They were, I think, 26-8 last year. They have some rebuilding. They lost 2 or 3 of their starters, but again, it's an SEC team that is coming into Assembly Hall, and it's not a home and away situation. It's just a one-off, which is something interesting in scheduling, I believe. They were number 53 in Torvik off-season rankings, so it's a good quality opponent. Again, Indiana beat them, move up in all of the rankings. And then the TBT, Summer IU team, made an announcement. Yogi Ferrell is going to be back again representing the team from IU. The TBT tournament began in 2014, a winner-take-all, $1 million tournament. Is it still just a million, or are they up to ante over the years?
I think it's a little more, but I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure of the purse.
But it's usually winner-take-all from the team. The team name is Assembly Ball. And it will play in the Butler Regional, July 19th through 23rd at Hinkle Fieldhouse in Indianapolis. Who's in the lineup so far? Point guard Yogi, shooting guard Devontae, small forward Miller Kopp, power forward Troy, and Jawan Morgan at center are the known players right now. We'll get more to you as I know. Those are the ones that I know. That should be fun. If you want something to do in July, go watch those guys play at historic Hinkle Fieldhouse. You'll never be disappointed going there. And then, as Galen mentioned, the Huber's Winery event takeaways. The event now sets up the NIL, and that is just a good thing in the space that college athletics is right now, to have these kinds of events, to raise this kind of money for our student athletes is very, very important. And then Mike Woodson, I thought, made some very interesting comments, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that as we end segment one, and I'll get some of Galen's thoughts on that. But the schedule, South Carolina, your thoughts, Galen, on IU adding South Carolina?
I mean, it seems like a good, albeit unexpected, scheduling addition. I mean, look, I think the profile is right. Lamont Paris has been there now 2 years, takes that team from really the dregs of the SEC in 2023 all the way up to a 6 seed in the tournament last year. They were a really interesting team in terms of who they chose to play last season. They played Virginia Tech on a neutral court, and they won that game. They beat Grand Canyon. They played Clemson, which is, that's their in-state rival, and really performed pretty well in the SEC overall. Beat Kentucky at home, beat Tennessee on the road. That was probably the big surprise of the SEC. So, look, it's one of those games that Indiana should win, and it's a game that should help their metrics. Because South Carolina, while they may not be as good as they were last year, is unlikely to be awful. They're probably like a 7, 8, maybe 9 win SEC team. And I like seeing Indiana play teams like that. It's relatively low risk. You add in what they're already doing with Atlantis, and you're not throwing away a lot of strength of schedule points essentially by playing a cupcake at home there. You're playing a team that can test you a little bit. Obviously, early on in the season, so you do worry a little bit because it took Indiana so long last year to get going, and that's always a concern. But you can't let that affect the way that you schedule. You have to assume that, last year there were problems. We know what the problems are. We're going to address those. And I'd rather they played South Carolina than South Carolina upstate.
Right. And it's interesting to see. We've tried to go play Arizona, and we've played UConn, and some of those games didn't go. Auburn didn't go the way we wanted them to go, and it was good to see Indiana back in those spaces again. But now you got to compete in those spaces, and you got to win for your metrics, but also for the fans who want to travel and do all of those things. So it'll be interesting to see if you tone that down just a little bit, but yet get good opponents in till you get things headed in the right direction. But regardless of who they play, November 4th, I think, is the first time they can play, or when the season is eligible to start. Well, they've got to come out and play ball at a much higher level than they did at the beginning last year in every game.
It's a complicated way to schedule right now. I mean, with the 3 games that you have to play in Atlantis, and now this game, and then is it Eastern Illinois that they've also got on the schedule now? Or I forget who the other team is. But regardless of who, I'll look it up here in a second. But ultimately, what you're dealing with this team is a situation where you don't have a lot of other games to play with in terms of the schedule. You're going to have some bye games, which for those who don't know what that term is, games against weaker opponents where you write a check to have them come, because you need some wins that you can just pad and practice and do rotations and try to figure out what your team is made of. But to some degree, what I think Indiana can do at this juncture is, make sure that they're gaming the system just enough that they get more bang for their buck, essentially, based upon who they schedule. And we have heard there's this hot rumor that Indiana is going to play Tennessee in an exhibition game before the season starts. We saw something like this with Purdue last year, where they went, I think, to Arkansas and they played an exhibition game. And that wasn't really a harbinger for how the season went. Purdue ended up in the national title game. Arkansas, had a terrible season. That was a close game, but those games are good because the atmosphere is there. And ultimately, I just think that as you try to figure out how you're going to position yourself, especially in a Big Ten where you don't really know how good it's going to be, you really need to carry as much strength of schedule momentum and metric momentum into the conference, because you may not get the boost that you would have gotten normally by playing against some of the teams that you're going to be playing against in the regular season. And that's a really interesting thing, especially since, there's very few home and homes in the Big Ten. So you don't even get the benefit from some of the top rated teams that you might play of playing them multiple times. It's a crapshoot to some degree, but there are things you can do to game the system in your favor. And I think that this fits into that category.
Yeah, and we'll see as the schedule pops out game by game, usually before it's set how that adds up. But scheduling is important for the roster that you have in order to put yourself in position to get into that tournament. And the TBT term. Oh, go ahead.
Well, the one last thing I was going to say, you're going to Atlantis. I keep emphasizing that at the end of November. You cannot slow burn this. I mean, look what happened to Indiana last year when they went to New York. They clearly didn't have it together playing either UConn or Louisville, right. And it really looked bad. And I think, one of the things that we'll probably talk about a lot more in the fall, it feels like Mike Woodson and his coaching staff really need to win IU fans over early to try to quell the naysayers who think, well, great, we've got recruits, but we're not going to do anything with them. I think it's really important for IU to hit the ground running, and I think it's a lot easier to do that when you're playing a named team, a team that most of the people on this roster, even though they were relatively young, remember going to the Final Four. For what was it, 2017? And that wasn't that long ago. You're going to get up for that a lot more than some of the opponents that Indiana had on the schedule last year at that time.
Yeah, and I think the early start is going to be hugely important, and we definitely will talk about that. I kind of like this tournament in the summer. I've seen schools that have really bonded together, and some of their former players have gotten together. I think of Syracuse as being a team that got together, and it'll be interesting. Indiana basketball has that tradition, and it's nice to see some of the former players getting together, and it gives the fans a chance to see something in the summer and reminisce about some of the players that we were very fond of. Your thoughts of the TBT tournament, the Elam ending or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'll say this. I like the fact the event is there, and I like the fact we can see the players play. And it reminds me a lot. I remember, when they used to do those summer games in various places in Indiana featuring alums. I remember going to one at Hinkle, actually. I think it was in May or April of 2000 or something like that. It was after that season ended, and that was a lot of fun. And even though, some of those guys I don't remember seeing on the floor, it was nice from a nostalgic perspective, and the arena was packed. I'm not too juiced about the 3-on-3 format just in general. I don't get a huge amount of enjoyment or even the Elam ending. Like, there's too many twists to it sometimes for me to get really fired up. But ultimately I do like the idea that it's there, and there's enough people that do like it that I'm not going to sit there and say they shouldn't do it. I think it's a nice addition to things.
Yeah, I think this one is 5-on-5 though.
5-on-5. Okay, good. Yeah,
this is that 5-on-5 tournament. But there is a 3-on-3 as well.
I have lost track at times of which ones are which is terrible of me. But yeah, it's nice that Indiana's able to bring together some people and have it matter a little bit more. So that should be good. I will say sometimes it can be hard to get people fully into the mindset in the middle of summer with some of this stuff, but maybe less so given the fact that we're going to have summer basketball through the Olympics. So, maybe it keeps everybody in the mood throughout the course of this entire offseason.
And finally, here on segment one, Huber's Winery event has transferred over to an NIL fundraiser, but it's basically where coaches and athletes come down from Bloomington and talk about their upcoming season. And it's kind of a start as the school year has ended and summer's there. And we really only have one program now. I think baseball, is there something? What else is golf or something going on still? But it's a time generally when it's just a restart, and Huber's has been that in the past, and you get a little foresight from coaches on what they're thinking and what they're doing. And, there were several comments that I read through from Mike Woodson that really kind of stuck out for me. And one was the emphasis on guard play and depth of getting guards, which there are now 9 wings. I know some of them might play at the power forward or 4 spot, as we've said in the past. But I really think that might be a little bit of maybe a look into a different type of offense, or at least different styles within. They're still going to have a couple post players and still like to feed the post with Bottle. You got to use a guy like that. But I think if you can read through the tea leaves when he says winning in college, that he's learned that you need to play guard play, there might be a little bit of a change coming from Indiana offensively, which I think, what were they, 105th in KenPom last year? I think that might be needed, and it looks like Coach Woodson is on to something. Am I reading too much into that, or what?
I couldn't tell. I mean, and obviously context is everything. I mean, I saw that quote that you're referring to on Twitter, and then I went and looked at Inside the Hall's transcripts of things, and it really seemed like he was talking more about the fact that, now 2 out of 3 years, essentially, really 3 out of 3 years, if you want to go back to the previous season, Indiana hasn't had a full complement of healthy guards. In year one, they had Rob Finney, who was banged up. They had, so Xavier Johnson had to take on a big load. The next year, Xavier Johnson gets injured, and that means Jalen Hood-Schifino has to take on a big load, and Trey Galloway has to play a bunch. Then last year, Xavier Johnson gets injured again. You really don't have a lot of cover. So I think to some degree, there's been people who looked at that quote and was like, oh, Mike Woodson finally realized you need guards in college ball. I don't think that was the nature of the quote, which I almost wish it was, though, because I almost wish it was like Mike Woodson saying, I'm turning over a new leaf and I'm really putting all the emphasis on the guards. It really felt more like I need healthy guards if I'm going to have successful seasons. I don't know that it necessarily means that you're going to have a change in the way that IU decides to play offense. I think that, however, if you're going to look for evidence where that is going to happen, I look more in the roster composition and the fact that they've really only got 2 functional bigs that are going to play more than 10 minutes a game. They're not going to be able to play the Twin Towers or quasi whatever, double big approach that they did last year with Ware and Renew. They're just going to run out of time. So they're going to have to play a bit smaller. They're going to have to play, have more guys that are kind of, 2 3s or 3 4s. And I think that's where you need to be. I'm just curious to see how that's going to come together. But look, I think Mike Woodson's at the end of the day, obviously right, that getting Rice and Carlisle, getting, Ja'Kai Newton hopefully healthy and able to play, having Gabe Cupps have a better season, having Trey Galloway be able to consistently perform. I mean, the pieces look like they're there on paper, but for the new people coming in, how quickly do they get up to speed? Miles Rice already on campus, I think already starting to, do stuff. He was at that NIL event. How quickly can Mike Woodson get them going? And what system do they play in? I'm really fascinated because Indiana's got a long way to go in terms of their offense. We have all talked about it. We've looked at it. It's like Indiana didn't do enough efficiency-wise. And so I am really fascinated to see how they twist that. Can you play Omar Ballo more than 25 minutes a night? It seems unlikely given just his, his size. I mean, it's hard for players of that size to really contribute at that level consistently over the course of an entire season. I mean, last year he only played 63% of available minutes, and he was great while he was in there. He was, top 200 player essentially in offensive rating. He was, was one of the best shooters in the country in terms of percentage, but you're not going to be able to just throw him out there for 35, 36 minutes a night. And so I'm really fascinated by how Woodson predicates the offense on guard play and figures out how to get all these pieces together.
Yeah, I saw the same thing too, and it was 50-50. Was it just the depth piece? But then at the back end, when he says this, he says we can play smaller a little bit with Mac and Goody probably playing some 4. And he said even the big fella, I'm going to try to play 2 bigs just to test it and see. So he kind of threw that back in there too. But at least there's a mention. I thought Indiana played well, and we've mentioned this, and we're not here to discuss this too much, but I thought they played better when Mbaka was playing the 4, and they started sharing the basketball and shooting threes a little bit. The smaller lineup, and maybe that's just, again, wishful thinking because that's what I'd like to see.
Right.
But, you have to give Coach Woodson, and a lot of us have been really hard on him, and maybe rightfully so, but maybe the personnel wasn't there to do some of that stuff. So he went out and got the personnel. That can be something we can hope for, to spread the floor and play a little bit more open with a smaller lineup.
You may be right. I mean, the one thing there where I'm still holding out is Mike Woodson's been the coach for 3 years. In 2 of those 3 years, his teams have been 95th in the country in offensive efficiency and 105th in the country in offensive efficiency for the entire season. And you can't use they didn't have Trace Jackson Davis last year because they did have Trace Jackson Davis in his first year, and they were still 95th in the country in offensive efficiency. So that isn't to say that it won't get better or can't get better. And I think that it almost feels like it has to get better, given the quality of the players across the board. And the fact that they bring in a guy like Luke Goody who can shoot, who can open up, if he's used properly, that they've got Bryson Tucker, who we're not totally sure what his piece, how it fits within it. You've got either a starter or a super sub in Trey Galloway. I just want to see what it looks like. And ultimately,
right.
I feel like at a place like Indiana, to be 3 full years into your time and not have coached a top 25 offense so far that's tough. That's a tough thing to overcome. You can only blame injury so much. And last year, there were certainly depth problems. So I am optimistic. I'm looking forward to the season. I'm looking forward to seeing what Mike Woodson does. I just don't know what it's going to look like at this point. And I'm curious where they're going to find that level of efficiency, given that, yes, Omar Ballo is a really, really awesome piece and was probably the best overall player in the portal. Is he a better offensive player than Trace Jackson Davis was? Because with Trace Jackson Davis, you didn't have a top 25 offense in the 2 years that you had him. That's the thing I'm probably curious about more than anything else.
And demonstrated ability. I was talking about that with transfer portals, but that also is with the team who's been coached for 3 years. We'll believe it when we see it, and we'll analyze it when it starts on November 4th. But what I am optimistic about is that Indiana baseball had a tough season, and somehow Coach Mercer found a way to make the tournament. They had injuries to their top 3 pitchers. They had injuries to the people who replaced them. Brock Tibbetts was out for a month with the foot. They have really struggled. But I'm really impressed with what he does with the baseball program and just the person that Mercer is too. But they start their tournament play tomorrow at 1 o'clock versus Southern Miss. Double elimination in Knoxville. They are in the number 1 seed regional, so it will be really, really difficult for them to come out. But their season was a success when they fought back and found a way to find some pitching to add to their hitting and overcome. I think good programs overcome deficiencies and injuries to meet a goal. And Indiana baseball is just fun to watch. So I'm going to be tuning in tomorrow at 1 o'clock. I think it's ESPN Plus or maybe the SEC Network. Well, that'll be later when they play Tennessee. And then IU football announced 3 kickoff times for its first 3 games, opening up on the first Saturday against FIU at 3:30. Excellent time for tailgating. Then they followed up the next week with a Friday night special, 7 o'clock on September 6th against Western Illinois. Those are the first 2 home games. And then they travel out to Los Angeles to play the UCLA Bruins. That will be a 7:30 Eastern time, which Galen will be in attendance. I thought about going out. I'm not sure I can make that trip, but I will be at home watching Indiana in the Rose Bowl. Something I never thought I'd see. And at least I get to see it in a regular season. Galen, your thoughts on either baseball or football as we end up here, segment 1?
I'll give you a little bit of both. No, I mean, tats off to baseball. That season looked dead in the water. They had that great early season series. I think they won a couple of games against I think it was Houston Baptist. I forget which team it was.
Yeah,
and then
Dallas Baptist.
Baptist. Sorry, there's multiple Baptists.
So many Baptists.
but no, they really looked like their season was lost with the injuries, with the pitching just kind of disintegrating. And all credit to the staff and Jeff Mercer and the players for pulling it together, almost winning the Big Ten. They make it out of that game, that second game in the Nebraska series. Who knows what happens? But for them to come back, get a 3 seed in a tournament where 2 weeks ago they weren't even really under consideration is a huge testament. It reminds me a little bit of the Indiana season from 3 years ago when Indiana, was on the outside looking in and they figured out a way to pull it together and get into the NCAA tournament. I don't know that Indiana is going to last that long. Tennessee is awesome. Like that is, you look at the statistics for that Tennessee team and you're like, I don't know how anybody beats them, but it's great to see Indiana there. And it's something that they can build on going into next season. And so I'm excited about that. And I know that as many people as get excited about baseball now with IU, they should. It's a really fun program to watch. As far as the football is concerned, it feels like it can't get here soon enough. And Coach, I don't know when the last time we really felt that way. I guess maybe 2021. Everybody was excited to get that season started. Look how that turned out. But the excitement's palpable. Now we've got times we can start planning. Someone, I think it was Quang in the chat, was like, "What Dr. GC has a sunburn." This is all Indy 500. This is 100%
post rain delay.
Yeah, well, because we're sitting there in the stands in turn 3, and it's been raining, it's cloudy all day. Do I think, let me bring some sunscreen into the state? No, I don't. And then, of course, it's right in my face the whole time, since turn 3 faces west. So it's fine. I needed some color, I guess. But no, I'm excited. Tailgating, you and I have done this for years, and we're looking forward to getting a chance to see the team out there. That California trip's going to be awesome. I've heard from so many Hoosier fans that are planning on being out there. Hopefully the rest of you come out and join us. It'll be a great time.
All right, that'll do it for segment 1. But coming up here on Assembly Call Radio, we'll discuss what's been a wild and transformative time for college sports. What do all the recent court rulings and NCAA announcements really mean? We'll discuss it next. Stick with us here on the Assembly Call. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We got a good show here going on already, and we're really going to get into the weeds here a little bit with all the changes that are happening to college sports. So we'll just jump right in and get it going. All righty.
I'm going to have some Doritos before we get started here. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
All right. You can do it while we go. It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
it's AC radio in the summer. Anything goes.
Right.
All right, here we go.
Hey, this is Max Bielfeldt, Big Ten champ and better than advertised Sixth Man of the Year in 2016. And speaking of better than advertised, join Jared, Andy, Ryan, and Coach on the Assembly Call after every IU basketball game. Go Hoosiers.
Welcome back to the Assembly Call. I'm the coach, Brian Tonsoni, here with the OG, Galen Clavio. And Galen, a lot has happened over the last couple of weeks in college sports. After a year or two, that a lot has happened with NIL, transfer portals. And there's been some court cases recently and some decisions to settle. And it's really, I know you're going to have a couple shows on Crimson Cast to really get into all the details, but for our listeners here, we'd like to just ask you a few questions about, what's going on and what is essential for everyone to know about what's happened recently with, I think it was House versus the NCAA, as far as payment of money earned by the NCAA. So, we'll let you get started with just a little intro, and then we have a ton of questions, and we'll just go from there and kind of riff on House versus the NCAA and what's happening in college athletics.
Yes.
Take it away.
I will have a longer kind of explanation on the House case itself and some of the immediate implications. That's actually going to post probably early tomorrow. So head over to the Back Home Network YouTube channel or hit the Crimson Cast podcast outlets, and you can find that there. But to Cliff Notes, is it Cliff's Notes? I think it's, or I've never known that. Anyway, regardless. So essentially, here's what happened. There were a series of lawsuits filed against the NCAA immediately after the NCAA essentially announced that they were going to allow NIL payments. And this was in direct response to a Supreme Court finding that the NCAA couldn't legally restrict access to money by players based upon the system that they had been using up to that point. It actually was, people have talked about like the Brett Kavanaugh opinion being an NIL thing. It wasn't. It was about restricting earnings. And so when that was announced, suddenly NIL was legal, and a bunch of athletes who had just graduated or were just about to graduate, including House, who was a swimmer at, I think, Arizona State. There was a soccer player at Stanford. There were a couple of other players at other, mostly West Coast institutions, sued and said, we were deprived of our ability to earn money by the NCAA essentially arbitrarily saying, well, now we're going to allow people to earn money on name, image, and likeness. So they sued, and the NCAA, talked a big game, but as this has progressed, this case, it became apparent pretty quickly the NCAA was in trouble. And so in order to save the NCAA from going bankrupt, which they very well could have done, because they would have, instead of paying $2.8 billion in a settlement, they might have had to have paid close to $9 billion in a settlement if they had lost it because of treble damages. they've settled with the plaintiffs and their attorneys. And essentially, there's two parts to it. Part A is that athletes in college from 2016 through 2021, when this ruling went into effect, will be paid essentially in arrears for the money that they could have made and didn't through NIL. That money, settlement-wise, is coming from a combination of people, including the NCAA itself. They're taking it out of their rainy day fund, essentially. The Power 5 conferences, and then the other 27 conferences that exist who are not Power 5. So that's the basketball-only conferences like the Big East, as well as the FCS conferences like the MAC or some of those. Well, the MAC's FBS, but it's Group of 5. You get the idea. So that's one half of the settlement. The other half of the settlement is that schools will be allowed, not required, but allowed to pay up to $22 million a year directly to athletes for name, image, and likeness compensation, which essentially means now athletes are not only allowed to be paid while being athletes, but they can be paid by the athletic department. They don't have to be paid by a third party like an NIL collective. And so that's the basis of it. And that's probably as much as we should get into before we start fielding the questions. But that's the landscape that we're in right now. Like the one caveat I'll throw in there is that the NCAA, as part of this settlement, has made sure to say this is not pay for play. You're not getting paid because you're an athlete. You're getting paid because of NIL, which, if that sounds like a dumb argument, it's a dumb argument. You're right. You've sussed that out properly. But it's important to understand that is a distinction that exists in this setup. And it is probably the first thing that will get challenged in court when the next round of this happens, whenever that happens to be.
So we have several questions. I have a few as well. I know too for a fact that a lot of the smaller conferences are up in arms a little bit, thinking they got the heavier price than some of the bigger conferences. And I don't know how all that settlement stuff is going to break down, but I know there are some controversies going back and forth between the different types of conferences as well. Let
me tackle that real quick, because I have heard that a lot. Ultimately, those folks complained because they were like, the Power 5 conferences should be paying more because this was money it's going to primarily go to football and basketball players. And it's generally going to the players that are at that highest level, that Power 5 level. And while I understand that complaint, at the end of the day, if the smaller conferences didn't want to be financially responsible for aspects of this, I mean, the way of looking at it is that monetarily it looks like more money, but there are only 5 power conferences and there are 27 non-power conferences. So yes, the power conferences are still paying 40% of the money. The other ones are paying 60%, but they represent something like 90% of the total number of schools. If they didn't want this to be the outcome, guess what they should have done? They should have stood up in the NCAA, debates and said, hey, we should be paying the players. We should be allowing them to earn money off of name, image, and likeness. So I'm not that sympathetic to the Big East and those other conferences. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I'm going to fire away. If the NCAA is saying it's not pay for play, but the schools can pay $22 million in NIL directly, why is that a needed distinction difference? And shouldn't, in my opinion, once we get pay for play in contracts, things will settle down a little bit with transfer portals and all of that stuff. I think that's eventually where I would want it to go as employees of the school, which I never thought I'd say 2 or 3 years ago. But what's the difference?
We need a break and have a sidebar with Coach Tonsoli here.
Yeah, what's happening? Who am I? But I would like to see it eventually end up there, but the NCAA is saying no, it's just NIL money from the athletic department, right? It's not paid for play. Why are they holding on to that?
Essentially, what the NCAA is trying to do is thread a needle, where they're trying to say, okay, athletes, we're going to pay you directly, and you're going to make more money than you've ever thought that you'd be able to make, but we're not going to call you employees, because if we call you employees, then we have to essentially treat you like employees, and we have to collectively bargain with you as individuals. And, in this settlement, one of the aspects of it is that the NCAA has asked the plaintiffs to stop fighting them for this antitrust exemption that the NCAA and its member institutions are trying to get, which they've lobbied and spent like $15 million lobbying Congress to try to get this antitrust exemption. Because ultimately, in the eyes of the NCAA, if they can maintain the non-employee status of athletes, then that saves them from having to essentially restructure the entire financial element of college athletics. And by saying it's NIL, and I don't think this will work. I just want to get this out of the way. They really think that they're going to be able to police intent when it comes to name, image, and likeness, and have it be, this isn't because you're going to school, it's because you have market value. Well, it's a garbage argument. And ultimately, what's going to be fascinating about it is the $22 million cap, is not collectively bargained. It's a revenue split, which represents 22% of the total amount of money that the NCAA and its member institutions make in television money and other revenue throughout the course of the year. That's the average amount. But it doesn't restrict. There's no restriction for the NCAA that they can put in on money that athletes can be paid by third parties. So even though in the fantasy land that this settlement has come in, the idea is all the money will just be coming from the athletic department. Realistically speaking, you're going to have schools, especially Southern schools, I think, who are going to pay the $22 million and also have a collective paying additional money. And this goes back to what you're talking about, Coach. This is not a workable system. The NCAA just needs to kind of bite the bullet and professionalize and say, all right, the time has come. Let's figure out a better way to do this, because what they are saying right now and how it's going to look in practice isn't really going to work. And I think it's probably going to get destroyed in the courts anyway as we move further down.
Well, and the NCAA hasn't been progressive at all with this, because you should have seen this 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line and moved ahead of the game instead of trying to fight for amateur status and all of that. As this money ballooned into the NCAA over the last, decade or 2 decades or whatever, they weren't proactive enough. And now they're trying to, if you're saying thread a needle by saying it's NIL, you're absolutely right. The collectives aren't going away. It's just now there's more money into the pool.
Yeah.
And so Jeff asked, does Galen see contracts for players in the near future? Is that something that's only pay for play, or is there going to be contracts with NIL collectives too, where you can't play 4 years, 4 different schools and keep upping your NIL money something? So how's contracts going to play out?
It's such a complicated landscape. I mean, ultimately, what the fans want, even if they can't express it, and I think what we all want as observers of college sports, we want a stable system where if a player commits to a school, they're there for however long, and they make X amount of money doing it, and the school makes X amount of money off of, in part, them and their teammates playing the game. We want stability. We want to be able to say, this is ours, this is theirs. We also want rules. Like, as much as people criticize the NFL or the NBA and they're like, it's just about the money, it's also about the rules. And it's about this idea that Team A has to abide by the same rules as Team B, and that is the case throughout the entirety of the organization. And it's why, like in the NFL, when very few teams break the rules in the NFL because they know that the penalties are so severe. You see the same thing in the NHL. You see the same thing in the NBA. Problem in college sports is these are all hyper-competitive institutions who want to screw each other and want to get the best competitive advantage. And right now, there's nothing stopping them. I mean, even within the conferences, the SEC, the Big Ten, there's these, vast differences in how certain teams do things. There's teams cheating, this and that. So to go back to Jeff's question about contracts, that's where everybody should be going. But the NCAA and its schools are so fixated on this idea that they don't want athletes viewed as employees because there's a variety of reasons for that. None of them make a lot of sense to me, but there's a variety of reasons for it, that they won't standardize the rules. They won't allow athletes to create a union to collectively bargain with. And so what that means, and I'm seeing things about like the Wild West in the chat, I don't know that goes away with this settlement. All it means is that the NCAA is now allowing its schools to pay players, but it's not going to stop the transfer portal. It's not going to stop a lot of the wacky movement and things like that. It'll stop a little bit of the contract abuse that we've seen in certain cases with NIL where players haven't gotten paid what they've been promised. But it's not going to suddenly settle the whole thing down because it didn't go far enough The NCAA hasn't changed the way it operates in any sizable way other than adding NIL payments to what they're already doing.
Craig asked, is there any scenario in which academic requirements or eligibility years go away down the road?
This is a great question. This is one I've gotten a lot. I mean, here's the thing, and this is something when I talk about this topic to students or to people, I try to emphasize this. The NCAA and college athletics in general is such a weird animal compared to what you get anywhere else in the world when it comes to player development. To have this much money in what is essentially kind of like finishing school before you go professional in these sports doesn't make a lot of sense. And tying participation to academic participation, I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense either when you compare it to how the rest of the world goes about doing this. I mean, you do not see this in soccer, the most popular sport in the world. You have academy systems. You have players that, they turn pro when they're 18 and then they kind of climb this ladder. I do think there'll be some kind of balance where, at least in the short term, you'll see the same academic requirements and the same academic kinds of things that we've seen up to this point. But I think a lot of schools are going to look at this and say, is this the model we really want to keep? And at some point, does it make sense to think about, right now, players are staying in college. We use the example of that player that transferred to Washington and got $2 million in NIL money for going to play for the Washington Huskies. That's about as much money as is guaranteed a late first round draft pick in the NBA. That's a ton of money. And in football, it's probably, as much, if not more, than your rookie salary minimum. That should be weird. The fact that you can earn more in college playing for Washington, not exactly the cream of the crop in college basketball, versus getting drafted by the Golden State Warriors or whoever's picking at the end of the draft, indicates that there's a bit of a value issue here. So I think ultimately the NCAA has a vested interest, and its schools have a vested interest in tying the athletes to the school, having them get educations. But I think they've got to be a lot more realistic about what that looks like. Maybe it's a part-time thing. You can scoff at that, but the number of players who have essentially gone part-time in the last semester that they're playing, not really finished, knowing that, hey, I can come back and get my degree in the summers. I don't have to do all of this right now. I think there's some value in that. And certainly from a brand aspect, what's the downside if you're a school? You're not losing anything.
So is there enforcement's always going to be big too, and how are you going to enforce any rules that you put on? They have to be meaningful, and it has to be done evenly across the board. Laura asked about private equity and NIL.
So the private equity thing is interesting because, the argument so we've seen this private equity going to come in and going to essentially give money to these athletic departments so that they can afford these NIL payments with the idea that they'll earn the money back. There's a larger scale argument that the private equity thing fits under, which is that college athletics, particularly football and basketball, are really under monetized. They're undervalued for what they could be based upon the huge number of people that watch them and care about them and buy tickets for them and see them on television. And that's kind of on purpose. And one of the things we love about college sports is that it's commercial, but it's not as nakedly commercial as the NBA or the NFL are. And so the question becomes, to me, you back up a little bit, and it's like, ultimately, there's plenty of money. The schools don't want to reapportion what they're doing budget-wise to afford it in many cases. And so they want to look for outside revenue sources because they don't want to take the hit on the money that they're already making. I mean, look at this the other day. We had the numbers that came in as far as the total revenue and the distributions from this past year. And the Big Ten was, I think they made something like $830 million in revenue in 2023. They distributed something like $72 million worth of revenue to each individual school. The SEC was not far behind. Even the ACC was like relatively close. There's so much money in all of this, and yet the schools are acting like they don't have the money to pay athletes. So that's where the private equity thing comes in. I think it's a bad idea. I think this is, again, going back to what we said, where the NCAA and its member institutions need to just take a break and say, we really need to change this system because we've been basically sitting around hoping Congress is going to save us with an antitrust exemption. That's not coming. We need to get serious about changing the model so that we get what we want out of it, and it's also still a good place for athletes to be.
I'm going to combine these next two questions because I think they head in the same way. But Mark asked about Notre Dame, where they may finally land in some sort of realignment for football. And then he throws in there, does it ever get to a point where Indiana, Purdue get pushed out for a premier football league or programs? John asked something very similar. He says Rick Telander wrote a book in 1989 called The 100-Yard Line, The 100-Yard Lie. I read it 30 years ago and didn't remember all the details, but it was about a super football conference. Payers to be paid, loosely affiliated with schools but not current students, earned scholarships after they were done playing. It made a lot of sense back then. Is it headed to something like that? Maybe we just addressed that last one. But is there a chance the NCAA gets restructured with the big power school football schools joining in some different entity and leaving some other current Power 5 or schools out? Is that something down the line where money will dictate that?
I mean, it could, but look, I think one of the things about the college game right now, even as we evolve, that we got a long way to go before it makes sense from a regionality perspective for the big football schools to split off entirely. And look, I think ultimately you really have to think about, yes, there's great brand equity, there's great brand value in college football, college basketball. They are still nowhere as popular as their professional counterparts. So we're not, if this was the only place we played football or the only place we played basketball, if this was the pinnacle, yes, I think you'd have a Premier League or NFL style like top division and you'd have people getting shoved up. But people have to remember, this is, at the end of the day, this is an intermediate level of competition. It's above high school and it's below the top professional levels, and that's always where it's going to be. So the idea that you're only going to cluster around like the top 20 or 25 brands at that level, you're leaving a lot of money on the table because, again, you might look at Indiana or Purdue and say, well, those are unimportant. Well, they still bring in pretty good television numbers. They bring in opportunities for bigger teams to play and fill stadiums. All of those things matter. And from my perspective, if we see something like that happen down the line, I mean, I'm thinking like 2050. Like, I'll be retired by that point and not talking about it anymore. I think it'll take that long before we get to that stage. I mean, heck, with this settlement, we're kind of locked into the same system we've currently got, even with the NCAA basketball tournament, for another decade, because the ability of the NCAA to pay this settlement is tied to their ability to make money off of the NCAA tournament. This is something I talk about in the podcast that I've got dropping tomorrow. Dan Wetzel wrote about it. It's like all these concerns that the power conferences were going to kill off the NCAA tournament feels like it's kind of out the window when you need the money from that NCAA tournament to now pay this settlement. And you need to keep that alive and continue to generate revenue off of it. So I think a lot of the fears they're valid to think about, but I wouldn't worry too much about them because we've got plenty of runway before that becomes a possibility.
Joel asked about Title IX, and he says, it looks like it might survive this first wave of monumental changes, but I see hurdles in the future for non-revenue women's sports or just non-revenue sports. Look in your crystal ball. Can Galen look inside his crystal ball into the future of women's athletics or Olympic athletics at the collegiate level?
I need to reenact that Bob Knight press conference from 93 or 94 where he pulls out the crystal glass and starts rubbing it. If you haven't seen that clip, by the way, folks, go check it out. So there's two separate questions on Title IX. Question A is, how does this settlement and how does these future like $22 million a year cap payments apply? And I talk about this extensively on the podcast I'm going to have dropping tomorrow. And the Cliff Notes version of that is, I don't think Title IX applies. Title IX, if you read it, is about access to opportunity. It's not about access to equal pay. And if you need evidence of that, I would invite you to look at the difference in the salaries being made for women's coaches and men's coaches. If Title IX was really going to be that big of an impact, I think we would have seen it there already. So As far as the larger question that Joel asks about whether or not sports will be able to survive, as far as Title IX is concerned, I do think that schools are going to have to make a decision about what is varsity versus what is an athletic program that is provided but is not supported at that level. And this is where, to some degree, the NCAA's obstinance and refusal to find a different model is probably going to have the most negative aspects. Because ultimately, we have built a system, I say we, and the collective we is that college athletics has built a system where they basically used women's sports, Olympic sports that involve men as kind of human shields to try to argue, well, you couldn't possibly change the financial system because these things pay for all of those things, football and men's basketball. When you're having to pay athletes in those sports, that money runs out real fast. And, I remember having some conversations with people a couple of years ago with college athletic departments across the country. And a refrain I heard multiple times was, we're not that far away from having like 4 varsity sports at our institution. Maybe more, depending on what you value. And certainly places like Indiana and Texas probably going to have your swimming and diving programs because that's Olympic training grounds. But for other sports that aren't as important, not only do you perhaps see those not being varsity status, but you're also seeing them going back to a very regional level of scheduling, kind of like it was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, where you're not getting on a plane, you're getting on a bus, and you're going and playing a team an hour away, not a continent away. We'll see. It's hard to predict, but I do think a lot of athletic departments are going to have to really take a hard look at what they value, what their alums value, and how much money everything's costing. I think the idea of having, 24 sports or 36 sports at Ohio State, or I think Harvard's got 48 sports. We're already starting to see that peel back, and we haven't even had the knock-on effects from this really fully hit at places like Stanford. So it's going to be really fascinating. And I would be concerned, especially if I was a sport that really didn't bring in a lot of money, because I just don't know that there's going to be the money there to continue to support at the same level that you've seen over the course of the last 20 years or so.
And this question comes from me. Athletes, are they the benefactor of this right now? And do they want a union? Do they want contracts themselves? Because it seems like they're getting more money and more freedom. What would be in it for them? What safeguards are there for them to have this eventually settle down into a employment situation? It seems like they're the ones who are benefiting the most and have the most freedom and opportunity right now in this new world.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a couple of things that people need to keep in mind. And a lot of people have decried lazy, or not lazy athletes, but greedy athletes. Justin, I know maybe somewhat tongue in cheek in the chats talking about most kids are not going pro in sports after college. I mean, here's the thing I would ask everybody to keep in mind. The system has always been incredibly one-sided towards coaches and programs. Scholarships are not 4 years; they're 1 year renewable. There's always been this aspect of players have not had the control over their own career pathways. People don't like the transfer portal, but it's funny to me that people complain about the transfer portal because they're in the same breath, they'll say student athlete. Well, the whole idea is it's a student, a regular student that doesn't play sports. If I want to transfer to another school, I just transfer to another school. I don't have to ask somebody's permission. It's just a matter of, can I get my credits to transfer? In sports, it's always been, well, you got to get your coach's permission, or up until today, it was like you could only transfer once and then you couldn't transfer again. The NCAA actually had to settle that case, and now they allow multi-time transfers. That just came down, I think, like 12 hours ago. So to some degree, I think there is, on top of the money, there's a value for everybody in having contractual protection. I know people don't like unions in general, but unions are important when you've got large numbers of people across a huge area set of businesses that don't have regular contact with each other, and you're dealing with multiple employers. That's why there's a players union in the NFL. It's why there's a players union in the NBA. These things we don't really think about until there's negotiations going on for collective bargaining agreements. But I do think that it would be helpful for athletes, and it would be helpful for fans. Again, this idea that we're going to sign this player and we can guarantee they're going to be here 3 years. Why? Well, we signed a contract with them for 3 years. Now, if they suck, we're not going to be that happy, because now you got a player that sucks for 3 years, but that happens already. It's so that, we're not talking about anything that's necessarily that earth shattering as far as I'm concerned. But right now, with all the financial incentives being go somewhere else and earn more money, it'd be nice to get some level of equilibrium. And I think you can only do that if you're putting pen to paper.
Well, Galen, there's a lot of information, and make sure you're tuning in to get all of the details with the Crimson Cast show that'll be uploaded, downloaded, available here soon. We thank you for that. It's just maddening, and there's a lot of good things that are happening, and it'll settle down at some point. It has to settle down. And I've gotten to the point now where I'm not even trying to figure out what it is. I'm just going to root for the uniform. When the helmets come on at 3:30, I'm going to root for Indiana, even if I don't know who's on the team or how much they're getting paid. Right?
I was at Pacers Celtics game 3, and that was a fun game. It was a shame the way that it ended, but someone reminded me the next day. It's like the entire starting five for the Pacers was different 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier or whatever it was. And did anybody care? Not really. So I do think that we argue in archetypes, and then when the rubber hits the road, people are excited for IU basketball next year, and we haven't seen most of the players in an IU uniform yet. So I do think a lot of the nostalgia aspects of things sometimes get the better of people, and we need to think about how we want to establish our fandom. Some people will be like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't have any interest. That's fine. There's plenty of other things you can go get excited about and root for. I just think this is a natural evolution, and it's something that probably should have happened a while ago, and that's just kind of how things work.
Well said. Okay, coming up on our third segment, we got some more questions, mailbag related to some other topics. We're going to answer those, so stick with us here on the Assembly Call. That's really good stuff. Almost as good as those Doritos that you're eating right there.
Those are good Doritos, I got to tell you. I missed dinner, so I'm trying to catch up a little bit.
But thanks for that. And it ultimately is, I do believe that the players deserve some financial compensation of some sort. And it's harder for people my generation to really accept that. And I was part of that for a long time. I understand what you said about the transfer portal. Makes sense. And that's where I finally got into off the old man, get off my lawn stuff, and let's just go to contracts, pay these people. And I'm almost going the full way of, do the part-time school thing. You bring, people to the college campus and all of that stuff. Change happens. But these athletes do a lot for these schools. Some compensation, fair compensation is okay. It's just it is more crazy and open than the NFL or the NBA or anything like that. I've said this in almost every show. I know Caleb Williams is going to be a Bear for at least 3 or 4 years unless he gets cut or traded, and then his rookie contracts come up, and then he can go. And there's some level of connection that you have knowing that he's going to be that quarterback for a while.
Look,
and I think that's something that I would like to see.
Yeah.
But I'm not shouting at the moon that it's not right for players to get paid and to move and do those types of things.
The whole argument was, players don't have any market value or brand value, so that why would we even give them the right? Well, guess what? Now we got guys transferring to Washington making $2 million a year, or Indiana's bringing in a guy from Arizona. He's making 1.2 or whatever it is. I don't know what the amount is that Balo's making, but there's clearly value because people care about college sports. And I always like it when I hear people saying, it needs to be about the academics. I'm an academic. I do this for a living. like, there's no justification for not paying the players. There's no justification for saying, oh, they're amateurs. Amateurism doesn't exist anywhere. Find me where amateurism exists, and we can have a conversation. I'll be waiting. So, it does. I mean, and look, I was like you 20 some years ago, before I started really looking into this, I was very much opposed to, players getting paid in college. And the more I looked into it, the more I was like, this is not a defensible argument. And the fact that it's taken this long to actually get to this point is sad. And the fact that the NCAA and its schools just refuse to just do the logical steps from here and are going to drag the entire set of sports kicking and screaming through a lot of years where there's terrible uncertainty and there's people potentially losing their jobs over all of this. Like, this all could have been addressed a long time ago, and it just was not.
Yeah.
So.
Good stuff. Look forward to listening to your show tomorrow while watching IU baseball, probably. All right, let's go get this last segment going. Here we go.
This is Jordan Halls, and I never miss a shot or an episode of the Assembly Call.
Welcome back to the Assembly Call. I'm the coach, Brian Tonsone. I'm here with Galen Clavio. It's now time for our mailbag. These questions, some of the ones we already asked, they all were submitted via our private IU basketball discussion community on Substack, where you can learn more about. Just go to assemblycall.com. But let's lead things off with a glorious deep cut, and with the football announcements of game times, a very, a good question to answer so we can drum up for this football season. Michael Morris asked, does Dr. Clavio still loathe store brand chips brought to his football tailgate? Looks to be a much different season. That might not necessarily focus on food in the lots.
I mean, there's always going to be food in the lots. And here's the thing. I just don't think the generic chips taste good. And if you're a chip connoisseur, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I just feel, honestly, that the generic chip thing to me, it's more of a low effort thing. I have bought, in some cases, hundreds of dollars worth of meat and other items that I cook for free for the people that come to the tailgate. When you show up with a bag of Kroger brand, ruffled kettle chips, I'm like, you really didn't put much thought into this, and I'm hurt personally by that. So, yeah, the one exception I will say, like the Kroger, the Fresh Times, like generic chips are actually really good. So I think it does to some degree depend on where you're getting them from. If you're getting them from Fresh Time, I'm okay about it.
All right, so what do you suggest? You have people stop by your tailgate. Someone wants to stop by your tailgate, and they want to bring something. They don't just want to show up. I know I've always told people just show up. First time, second time. If you're going to be a long time person, we'll put you on the list to bring something in. But there's a lot of people that feel, they want to bring something to a tailgate when they've been invited. What's your suggestion for someone who's going to stop by a tailgate?
So, drinks are always at a premium. It feels like drinks go quickly. It could be non-alcoholic. I mean, a small, like one of those little 8 packs of Pepsi Zero or of Sprite work really well. There's, I think cookies are actually a really good bring. Although less so now because people are very anti-carb. To some degree, like the problem with chips, other than the generic thing, is there's too many chips. Everybody brings chips. Everybody's thinking, I gotta go to the tailgate. I'm gonna grab a bag of chips. I've left tailgates, gone back home, and I've got 9 bags of unopened chips. And I'm like, well, I can use these next time, I guess. But then guess what happens at the next tailgate?
9 more bags.
9 more bags of chips. And so I do think, it's a tough one. I try to stay in communication with the people that are going to be stopping by the tailgate. And in many cases, I tell them, don't worry about bringing anything. We got plenty of stuff. We're fine. But if you want to bring something, ask, and I'll let you know what would make sense to bring along. And, I'm very reachable on a lot more people than probably should have my number and text me, and that's fine. That's good. I always say, drinks are a good default, especially if it's a small pack of something that easily fits into the cooler. I noticed our friend Hooperazzi mentioned ice. I don't always recommend bringing ice because ice is hard to carry, but You can be creative too. Bring a can of cheese, like spray cheese or something like that. Bring something that you can add to something else. Try to think about, what's the whole chain of food that you might be looking at. But always, if you can, check with the host or check with whoever invited you, see if they know. That's better than just showing up. It's always appreciated. The thought counts. But, there's a logistical element to it that can be difficult. And this is, again, the number of people who choose to host tailgates is relatively small. You know this as well as anybody.
Yeah.
And there are logistical elements that you as the host have to think about that your friends who are just attending probably haven't thought about.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the items you go home with when you unload your vehicle, from random chairs to eclectic versions of leftover beer and booze that found its way into your cooler. I would suggest if you're going to be a first stop, I know ice is hard to bring if you're going to 3 or 4 different stops and it melts and all that, but when you get there early like you do, and when I was hosting the big, by the time you're there for 2 or 3 hours, you need some ice. So I would say contact the person who you're thinking about, and if they do need ice, that's when you should bring it. Otherwise, it is kind of very difficult to bring.
And one other thing, and this is probably doesn't apply to someone like you who comes in, you get like the C-130 and you like paradrop in, with all your stuff coming in from Delphi. So I live obviously in Bloomington. I got a lot of people who are in Bloomington who come to the tailgates. I'm totally fine if you want to say, hey, I'm coming to the tailgate. Can I stop by the house on Friday and drop something off? That makes it so much easier because then I get to throw it in the truck. You don't have to worry about carrying it. I don't have to worry about what is this person bringing and how does it mesh with what I'm planning to cook. So I'm okay with that. And we can meet in a neutral location, that's totally fine, whatever. But yeah, that's another aspect that we can think about.
Now, I need some Dorito chips. You got me hungry here talking about
these packs are great.
Food.
My wife bought these, only 150 calories a pack. Like that's perfect.
There you go. Craig asks this general question: how uncommon is the one-off home game against a power conference team like South Carolina? Is that common? Usually it's, like Kansas. We played at Kansas and they returned the visit to Assembly Hall. How uncommon is that one-off?
In this era where you've got so many multi-team events, it's less common. They used to happen more often. Like Indiana would do these. It's funny. I mentioned this on Twitter when the game got announced. Like the last time Indiana played South Carolina, I was on the broadcast call. It was me and Mike Petrie on WIUS at the RCA Dome. That was a weird one though, because it was like a tournament. I think Seton Hall was who Indiana played in the first game, and then they played South Carolina in the second game. I don't even know who the fourth team was in that, but it's a little bit of an odd arrangement, but it's an odd time for scheduling. I think it was a lot more common in an era when teams would play 14-game or 16-game conference seasons. To have 20-game conference seasons and to have to balance everything around that is a bit of a challenge. So I think, a lot of these schools, think about what Indiana did in football, where they were set to play Louisville the next couple of years. They back out of that. They go find, I think Charlotte was the team that they used to fill that, or maybe it was Western Illinois, but they had to go find another team to fill that gap. I think a lot of schools are in an era now with all of these shifts. And South Carolina being in the SEC, they might have had something scheduled, and then it's like, oh, guess what? Texas and Oklahoma are joining the league now. We probably need to change what we're doing. So I think it's probably going to be more common moving forward. It's not something that we see that isn't tied to something else like an ACC Big Ten challenge, though, over the course of the last decade.
And our last question from Kyle here is expansion done for a while? Are we going to see more teams in the Big Ten? Do we add 2 more to go to 20? Is that acquisition of brands an ongoing thing in this new environment?
I don't think it's going to stop. I think it might slow down a little bit just because it seems to come in waves. And, again, you got to keep in mind that this whole wave of expansion and the Pac-12 disintegrating was essentially because the SEC got greedy and decided that they were going to go and grab Texas and Oklahoma. Now, you can kind of understand why, because when you look at the revenue distributions, the Big 12 is bottom of the Power 5. And so I'm sure that Texas Oklahoma looked at it and was like, well, this is a no-brainer. But that's why the Big Ten goes out and adds all those Pac-12 schools, and it's why the Big 12 then adds the rest of the Pac-12 schools. It's why Stanford and Cal end up in the ACC. I think what will probably happen is going to largely depend on what occurs with this ACC situation. Clemson and Florida State look hell-bent on getting out of that conference. And they've got lawyers making some pretty fascinating arguments about how they should not be contractually tied to the conference that they're in, that this grant of rights situation is not sustainable as a legal entity. It's interesting because the ACC's been desperately trying to keep their television contract with ESPN and their grant of rights from being public. And the rest of the conferences just filed an amicus brief today, essentially saying, yes, this shouldn't be public. Everybody's terrified about the terms of the television contracts becoming public. And that tells me if Clemson and Florida State figure out a way to get out of the ACC, I think it's open season at that point. And then it's a bidding war, and then North Carolina is going to look to go somewhere else, and then Virginia is probably going to look to go somewhere else, and then Stanford and Cal are back essentially where they were before, and they become properties that are back on the open market. So I think we're in kind of a detente period right now with all of this, but this could turn from a cold war into a hot war again pretty quickly.
All right.
That's it. We're done. No more questions.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. Galen, share with everyone the upcoming podcast with more than the Cliff Notes
yes.
on all of this stuff.
We're actually going to have probably 3 or 4 podcasts where we dive into all the aspects of House versus NCAA. First one was recorded. I'm going to drop that in the morning, so check that out on Crimson Cast on iTunes or whatever, Apple Podcasts now, Spotify, and then also on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. Going to have another one next week. The plan right now, we're going to have Ben Portnoy from Sports Business Journal join us. We're going to talk through some things. I'm going to do another pod where I lay out a potential future for college athletics that is a different model from where we're currently at. I think some people will enjoy aspects of that and not enjoy other aspects of that. That's essentially the story of my life. So I'm looking forward to talking through these things. We've already taken some questions from folks. You can always send us questions on Twitter at CrimsonCast. You can if you're in our Discord, you can send some questions there. But this is something we'll probably keep touching on throughout the course of the summer. It's a good topic to talk about, and there's so many different avenues that we need to touch that we just haven't yet. So, stay tuned.
Very, very good. And Doing the Work is going to have a podcast, Ask Me Anything. I think X's and Joe's is working on something if they don't have something new out. A lot of stuff going on here at the Back Home Network. But that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Assembly Call. If you want to see us do the show live, join us at assemblycall.com on Thursday evenings for the live broadcast of our Assembly Call radio recording. Thanks to Bob Thompson for producing our music, and thanks to John Ringer of rigdesign.com for designing our logos. And thank you for listening. Until then,
take it from me, Yogi Ferrell. Keep your elbows in and your eyes on the rim, and go Hoosiers.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out.
Hey, the show's over. Here I come, Coach Tonsoni.
it's just a sound bite, Galen.
Tremendous. I love it. It brings a smile to my face. Every time you hit the button, I just enjoy the hell out of that one. So.
We've been married, 32 years?
That's great.
It's 10:30, or 10:18. No, she's got her cup of coffee and her, I don't know, Netflix.
She drinks a cup of coffee before bed?
Decaffeinated.
Oh,
yeah,
well, okay.
We both share a little Michigan cherry, Keurig. We're old.
No, that's great. I love it.
So, all right, man. Thanks for coming. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks to everybody that was here, and go Hoosiers. We'll talk to you soon.
All righty.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
You too.